3 weeks after their father's funeral, Gregory Whitfield slid a single sheet of paper across the kitchen table to his sister, and he told her that it was finished. It was a new will, one he said their father had signed 11 weeks before he died, and it left 95% of a $1.4 million estate to Gregory, and exactly $1 to Eleanor, the daughter who had spent the last 3 years feeding their father, bathing him, and writing down everything that he could no longer remember. Gregory believed that piece of paper was the end of it. What he did not know was that his sister had been keeping a record of her own, and he had not thought, not even once, about the date printed at the top of their father's diagnosis. To understand what that single dollar really meant, you have to go back 6 years to the version of this family that still worked. Arthur Whitfield had been a civil engineer for 38 years, and he had built bridges in 3 different states. And he talked about those bridges the way other men talk about their children. He was a precise man, the kind who kept his receipts in labeled envelopes, and who once mailed a tax refund back to the government because he was convinced it had been calculated in his favor by mistake. He had 2 children. Gregory, the elder of the 2, was the one Arthur bragged about, the son who had moved away to the city, who wore the good suits, who called on the holidays and sent photographs of a life that looked like an advertisement. And then there was Eleanor, Nell, the younger one, the quiet one, who stayed in the same small town, who fixed her own car, and who, when their mother died in 2018, simply began showing up at her father's house every single day, without anyone ever having to ask her to. In 2019, Arthur did what careful men do, which is that he sat down with a lawyer and he put his wishes in writing. The trust he signed that year divided everything equally between his 2 children, and it named Nell as the trustee, the one he trusted to carry out his wishes after he was gone. And it gave the house, specifically and deliberately, to her. There was even a line in his own handwriting in the margin of that document, and it read simply, "She is the one who stays." That was the father they both had, while he was still himself. The question this story answers is what happened to the version of Arthur Whitfield that came afterward, and which of his 2 children was sitting beside him, writing it all down, when it did. Because in February of 2022, Arthur Whitfield forgot how to drive home from the grocery store that he had been driving to for 40 years. The diagnosis was Alzheimer's, and the doctors measured the decline with a simple test that is scored out of 30 points. The first time they gave it to him, Arthur scored an 18, which is to say that a man who had once calculated the load tolerances of suspension bridges could no longer reliably count backward from 100 by 7s. Nell did what she had always done, which was to show up, but showing up meant something very different now. She moved into the spare bedroom, and she learned which foods he would still agree to eat, and she learned that he was calm in the mornings and frightened after 4 o'clock. And slowly she rearranged her entire life around the strange new geography of her father's fear. And because she was Arthur Whitfield's daughter, she also began to keep a record. She wrote in it every single day, the date at the top, and then what he had eaten, and what he had remembered, and what he had not. She was not doing it for a lawsuit. She had never once imagined that there would be a lawsuit. She did it because writing things down was the family religion, and because some part of her wanted a record that this had actually happened, that her father had been here, and that she had not left him alone in it. By the time it was over, there were more than 1,000 pages, and while his daughter was upstairs writing down what her father had managed to eat, you might reasonably ask where Gregory was during the 3 years that the man was slowly disappearing. The answer is that he was on the phone with the bank. In the summer of 2022, Only a few months after the diagnosis, Gregory arranged for his father to sign a financial power of attorney that named Gregory as the agent who was allowed to move money on Arthur's behalf. On paper, it looked reasonable enough. Someone, after all, had to manage the accounts. But it is worth watching closely what that piece of paper quietly became. Over the following 14 months, Gregory used that power of attorney to move $314,000 out of his father's accounts, and every single one of those transfers was labeled in the same tidy hand as care management, a care that the daughter who was actually providing it never saw a dollar of and never once saw a bill for. She did not know any of that yet. She was upstairs writing down what her father ate. Arthur Whitfield died in March of 2024, at home, in his own bed, with his daughter in the room. And for 3 weeks afterward, Nell grieved the way that you grieve a person you have already been losing, a little at a time, for years. And then Gregory called the family together, and he slid that single sheet of paper across the table. It was a new will, one he claimed their father had signed in January, just 11 weeks before the end. It revoked the trust from 2019 entirely. It erased the equal split between them, and it erased the gift of the house, and it reduced the daughter who had stayed to a single, deliberate, humiliating dollar, accompanied by a line that read, "To my daughter for reasons she understands." Gregory had his explanation ready, the way people always do when they have rehearsed it in advance. He said that their father had finally seen things clearly at the end. He said that Nell had spent those years quietly managing the old man, isolating him, turning him against his own son, and that the $1 was simply Arthur's way of making a point. Here is the thing about a rewritten version of history, though. It only has to survive contact with the people who do not happen to have kept the receipts. Nell did not argue at that table. She has said since that she felt something inside her go very quiet and very cold. She drove home in the dark, and then she did the only thing she had ever really known how to do with a problem, which was that she opened the notebook. Because every page of Nell's journal had a date written at the top of it, and one of those dates was the 6th of January 2024, the very day on which the new will insisted that Arthur Whitfield had knowingly, soundly, and of his own free will, sat down and disinherited his daughter. Her entry for that day described a man who had asked her 4 separate times whether his late wife was going to be home in time for dinner. So Nell put everything into a single banker's box, and she carried it into the office of an estate litigation attorney named Priya Anand. She did not bring the lawyer a feeling, and she did not bring her a grievance. She brought her a timeline. Anand would say later that it was the most organized intake she had seen in 20 years of doing this work. And the reason it was so organized is that Nell had not built it in a panic in the weeks after the funeral. She had been building it, without ever knowing it, for 3 years. This is the timeline they laid out on the table, in the order that actually mattered. The first thing was that the diagnosis came before the document. The law requires that a person have what is called testamentary capacity. At the moment they sign a will, they have to understand what they own, and they have to understand who they are giving it to. But Arthur had been formally diagnosed with dementia 23 months before the date on that new will, and by November of 2023, his score on that 30-point test had fallen all the way to 11. The will was asking a court to believe that a man who could no longer count backward by sevens had executed a careful, deliberate revocation of his own trust. The second thing was that the only people in the room were the people who stood to gain. The new will had been notarized by a man named Daniel Cofield, who happened to be Gregory's business associate, and it had been witnessed by Marion Whitfield, who happened to be Gregory's wife. The only two people present when a dying man supposedly cut his daughter out of his estate were the two people with the most to gain from his doing exactly that. The law has a particular name for what that arrangement raises, and that name is undue influence. The third thing was that the money had already left before the will ever arrived. $314,000 had been moved out under that power of attorney, labeled as a care that the actual caregiver had never seen. And once you understand that, you understand what the new will really was. The new will was not the theft. The new will was the cover story, the document drawn up to make the earlier one look legal in hindsight. And the fourth thing, underneath all of it, was that the real Arthur Whitfield had left his intentions in his own words, written down while he was still himself. There was a trust he had signed while sound of mind. There was an email he had written to a friend in 2021, which said, in plain language, that the house was Nell's, that it had always been the plan, and that Gregory knew it. And there was that single sentence in his own handwriting, in the margin of the 2019 trust: "She is the one who stays." Gregory had managed to rewrite the ending of the story. What he had not been able to do was go back and rewrite everything that had come before it, because his sister had quietly kept all of it. In the end, the case did not go to a long and dramatic trial, because cases like this one rarely do, once the dates are sitting on the table where everyone can see them. Faced with a medical record that placed his father's incapacity 2 full years before the will, and a bank ledger that placed $300,000 of his father's dollars in his own account, Gregory's lawyer advised him to do the only thing that was left to advise. The court declared the new will void for lack of testamentary capacity and for undue influence. The 2019 trust, the real one, the one their father had signed while he was still their father, was reinstated and allowed to control. Gregory was ordered to return every dollar of the $314,000 that he had moved. The estate was divided the way that Arthur had written it down while he could still write. And the house, with that handwritten line still sitting in the file, went to the daughter who had stayed. Nell did not celebrate any of it. By her own account, she sat alone in that house for a long time, and she did not feel as though she had won a single thing. She had buried her father, and then she had spent the better part of a year proving, in a courtroom, in front of strangers, that he had loved her, which was the one thing she had never actually doubted on any of the 3 years of pages she had written by his bed. There is a reason that people believe the will is the final word. It is the last thing a person signs, and it is read aloud in a quiet room, and so it feels like the end of the story. But a will is only ever one document, and a person leaves behind a paper trail across their entire life. The emails, the journals, the date a doctor writes at the top of a report, a single sentence left in the margin of a trust. Those documents do not care which child was favored. They do not care who told the better story at the funeral. They were written down while it was happening, by people who did not yet know how any of it was going to end. Gregory rewrote the last page. His sister had kept all of the others. The truth has a paper trail. We follow it.